is really the thrust of the talk. Are we there yet? I would argue mainly, yes. And I would say as well that the sort of police-state idea, you know, the idea of living under the Stasi, for example, in East Germany, where your flat can be bugged, where all your friends are turned, where your phone can be tapped, all that sort of thing, is also where we're going now. But that's just the tactics of the totalitarian state. The totalitarianism is the control. That's what they want. Governments want control and power. So, has anyone seen the film called Das Leben der Anderen? Lives of Others? Yeah? I think this is such a good exemplar of it. The premise being that you have someone in the Stasi in East Germany who has to investigate a couple and then becomes very sympathetic to that couple. So you have the watcher and you have the watched. And then you have the sort of resolution where the watched realises how much he's been watched when the East German wall comes down. I found that film fascinating, having been on both sides myself. And it's very accurate in terms of how endemically wide that sort of surveillance can be. So I do recommend, if you haven't seen it, please do go and watch that. I've also just moved to Germany in the last year, and I sort of joked with my friends at the time that I did that to escape the encroaching fascism of the UK state. And it's true. I mean, this is a far more fascistic state in terms of control, the degrees of control, than Germany is. Germany's got it out of its system. It's got a rock-solid constitution to stop any of that stuff happening again, because they're scared that they could slide that way. So even though the government there has this willed power, this willed control its citizens, because of post-war 9/11, war and terror, the courts are upholding the constitution and saying, no, we have basic rights, and we have rights for a reason, and we're going to uphold them. I don't think there is any real sort of ism, though. I talk about totalitarianism. In the old days, it was communism or whatever, as it became a sort of controlling ideology. But I don't think there is one unless we go along the Mussolini quote, which was the merger of state and corporations. And that was his definition of fascism. And I think nowadays we are seeing that more and more, where big globalized corporations are buying or controlling our governments, what is notionally our democratic representation. And we're seeing that more. So I would say that we are sliding, again because of that, into this sort of situation. Our civilization is fragile, and our liberties, our rights, are hard won. If you go back the last 500 years in Western Europe, with the move away from medieval religion and the Enlightenment and rationality and all the rest of it, every single right that we have now, be it the right of freedom of expression, the right of conscience, the right of women's rights or race rights or whatever, they're all hard won. People have died for them, they fought for them. And yet, at the moment now, we're living in an era where we have post 9/11, the war on terror, and we're just giving them away in the notion of, well, that'll increase our security. And that's rubbish, it's rubbish. But where are we? As I mentioned, there are certain areas that governments feel, or the elites feel, they need to control in order to have this sort of guard on their citizenry, this sort of totalitarian aspect. And I would say there are probably 5 areas that are crucial to them. First of all is the political sphere. And how many people here trust what politicians say, mainstream? Okay. Yeah, that says it all. The idea of totalitarianism is that it's a one-party state, quite often, with one ideology. Now, we live in a notional democracy. We have this idea that, yes, we can vote every number of years and all the rest of it. But actually, is there much choice? It's very centrist. All parties have fought over the central ground. So it is effectively a sort of one-party state. But then you look at how our legislators, our MPs, can operate, and they can sometimes just be criminalised almost. I mean, there was a famous case a couple of years ago of a Tory MP called Damien Green. I always want to say Damien Hirst for some reason, which is a bit weird. Damien Green, who was a Tory shadow cabinet member, and he had been encouraging leaks from the Labour Home Office about immigration figures. And suddenly, because of this, the police, the secret police, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, went crashing into his home, and they went crashing into his Westminster office, and did a counter-terrorism style search in both of those. I mean, this is the secret police, they're supposed to work on terrorism, and this guy is taking leaks from the government, and they do this to him. So this is an MP, and of course at that point all the other MPs stand up. I don't know how many of you remember the case. All the other MPs stood up and said, we're living in a police state, this is terrible. Well, why the hell do you pass the laws that allow this to happen? Or is it just you think it's not going to happen to you lot? Pretty much. And it was also quite resonant for me because his wife then, who's a leading child protection barrister and worked on a number of sensitive cases and had all this information in their home, she was working from home in her home computer, and these secret police take all this information. So there were sort of articles about how she felt violated and there'd been this rip-up of her home and they'd taken all this stuff, and it was exactly the same. I know how she feels. I know how she feels. So we have that, and then we also have other examples of people like Geert Wilders, the Dutch MP, who attacks Islam. He's he's very right-wing. He's a bit like the BNP, but he's in Holland. But he wanted to come over at the invitation of the House of Lords in 2008 to show his film about the spread of Islam and everything. Now, much as we might find his views odious or whatever, I still say he has a right to put those views across, because he's not going to win people over necessarily. But he was banned from coming into this country initially. And then, of course, we had, in the obverse, George Galloway, the independent MP for East London, who flew to Canada to do some anti-war talks a couple of years ago and got banned from entering Canada. So some of the MPs are being sort of victimised. They're being stifled from doing what their job should be, which is to say what they think, because they've been elected to do that by a certain constituency. Whether we agree with them isn't not really an important matter. And yet, on the other hand, we see MPs acting as if they're above the law. We have not only the expenses scandal that's been rumbling on, where they just put their snouts in the trough and hoover up public money, and then just don't think they've done anything wrong. They've just been playing the system. Some of them, I think, there's been about 5 MPs that the Serious Fraud Office wants to prosecute for fraud because they've lied so egregiously about their expenses claims. And they turned up at Bow Street Magistrates Court and said, "We don't recognise this court of law. We are not going to be put on trial by you. We are only going to allow ourselves to be tried by our peers, who are other MPs." They actually went into a London courtroom and said this. "We're not going to recognise this hearing." So they think they're above the law in that sense. And actually, to a certain extent, some of them are. I mean, think about slightly more egregious sort of examples of them taking us into war and things, and the war criminals are never prosecuted. There was an interesting case in the Netherlands recently. The outgoing Prime Minister, Jan Balkenende, was in place in the run-up to the Iraq War. And he did exactly what Tony Blair did. He was immediately there, part of the coalition of killing. I'm with you, George Bush, let's send some troops in, all the rest of it. And yet there has been a judicial review in the Netherlands in the last couple of years, saying, these are legal law judges saying, there was no case to go to war, it is illegal. The fact we went to war with Iraq is illegal. And yet this guy could still carry on as Prime Minister, even though he committed those war crimes in the view of his senior court in the Netherlands. He hasn't been prosecuted for them. So I suppose there is an element where they do think they can get away with it, but they're never held to account. So there's that aspect. There's also the sort of lobbyist stuff as well, where they get money from different lobbyist parties. So they are more in the corporate pay. But I think that's probably something that is more pertinent in America, where they've just passed a law that allows corporations to pay anything they want to fund their favoured candidates in elections, up to and including the president. In the past, there was a cap. But now you can buy a president for $1 billion. It's that easy. So that's our political institutions. Of course, there's also the fact that they really don't know what's going on, whether they want to represent us or not. I mean, they're too busy with their snouts in the trough, I presume, to actually look at what they're passing as law. So we have a situation, for example, the notorious situation of the run-up to the Iraq War, way back in 2003, where we all know there was spin, we all know the argument around David Kelly, we all know the fact that the intelligence services fabricated intelligence and lied, and the government lied too. But then the MPs just fell for it, or appeared to fall for it. So you have a situation where they're about to vote on whether our country goes to war, and they are just pushed over the edge by headlines the day before saying 45 minutes from Armageddon, 45 minutes from doom. Do you remember all those headlines? They were saying, weapons of mass destruction, they can be fired. So they don't even know what they're talking about. They have to go with the lies that they're told by the intelligence agencies and by the government. So that's the political institutions. The judiciary, of course, is another key area to keep a citizenry quiescent. Keep them in line, make sure they get punished if they step out of line. And where are we here in this country? Well, it's a bit of a Kafkaesque nightmare now, to be quite frank. We're in a situation where we have, certainly in terrorist cases, as if there's some special category. They're not. If someone commits a terrorist offence,
sense of realization as opposed to a trend that the world is going down. For instance, you quoted Franklin, interesting quote on liberty, a man who owned 200 slaves. And we know from DNA profiling, when he had children with one of those slaves.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I'm trying to say is the aristocracy, and call it what you will, they're essentially an aristocracy, has always been like this. Why do you think it's changed now? I mean, take the Vietnam War, for instance, same kind of stuff. Why is things changing now? Is this your realization, or are we really changing?
It's my hope, I think, is the best way of putting it. I think we do have a window of opportunity at the moment, which we've never had in history before, because we have the internet, which is still a free-flowing thing, they're trying to sort of corral it and control it in all sorts of different commercial ways now. But for the last 15 years so there's been an explosion of free flow of information, opinions and awareness of stuff. And education as well, because, if you read a book, it's been funneled through a system, so you read what you're allowed to read, sort of thing. I think it's partly my experience of what I saw on the inside and then what I experienced on the outside, having crossed them. So I know what it's like. That's why I feel very passionately about trying not to go down that path for everybody. But I do think we are sliding that way. But no, of course, nobody's perfect, and the American Constitution is certainly not perfect because of the era it was written in, with slavery as an issue and women's rights not being mentioned and everything. But it was a product of this sort of enlightenment, this idea of discussion about rights, which has progressed as well still since then. But the trouble is we seem to have got blasé about them. We've got them, we take them for granted. It's like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that came in after the Second World War to stop atrocities like the concentration camps or civilian bombings or war crimes. And we take it for granted. We know nothing of war, really, do we? What we see of war is like a video game from Iraq or Afghanistan. But to have gone through that and to try and ensure not to go through that again is what those people bequeathed to us. And I think it's worth still at least educating ourselves, and if we think it's important enough, fighting for ourselves as well. And I think it's not good enough in a way if people don't. They just take it for granted. What sort of world are our children going to grow up in, especially with other challenges coming along? So.
I was wondering what you think about the idea that, you're talking about totalitarianism, but at the same time you can come and talk to us about your experiences, and anyone who's interested can go on the internet and snoop around and find a few things. And cases that you've talked about, they talk about the results of them and what's happened. But at the same time, we're almost drowning with distractions. So in parallel to that, to those actions, we've got, standing up.
Okay.
In a sense, these stories come out, but then they get lost so quickly in a swamp of oversaturation of information. Yeah. So that could be almost the enemy to, the truth gets diluted down in this sea of distraction. So it's a different kind of totalitarianism, because I guess before we think about totalitarianism, we think about the Stasi or Stalin, or where they couldn't really get access to the truth, to other information, unless they were really being quite underground and radical. But now I think average people can go in if they're quite interested and try and find this information and can find the truth, but it gets drowned in that.
Absolutely,
it's a different type of, it's a new form of totalitarianism.
Yes, yeah. The whole idea of advertising and social control, I think, came from this chap Bernays, who was one of the inspirations of the Nazi regime and how to sell ideas. No, I entirely agree. It's a sort of bread and circuses idea, isn't it? Just get people distracted so they don't think about they just take for granted what they have, and they could lose it and wouldn't even notice for the first few years because the government's not going to get too heavy. But no, one of my slightly flippant pet theories was, the phenomenal success of the series Big Brother, this reality show. And you think, God, why on earth would anyone do that to themselves? It came out when I was still doing whistleblowing, and I was thinking, God, I might live in a flat that's got surveillance. How could anyone want to do that to themselves? And I think, in a sort of flippant sort of way, it's almost like grooming a society. It's like, well, you can go in, you can be surveyed 24 hours a day, and if you win, then you